Okay, nonfiction. Are we good? We're going to talk nonfiction. This is actually one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's probably what I did the worst job of teaching when I was in the classroom. True story. I feel like it was something like when I stepped outside of the classroom, my eyes were opened to so many different aspects of nonfiction that I was not teaching into in my classroom. So I'm hoping that I can just share some of those things with you guys. And then this will help you either in your current units. I know lots of you are in nonfiction right now, or even moving forward. And I thought I would start by just reminding us that when we were together the last time, back at the end of October, we talked about 3 different major categories that we look at when it comes to reading. And when we listen to readers, we were listening to my little nephew again, and we talked about these 3 categories. Do you guys remember this? Habits, process, and comprehension. And it was fiction focused. He was reading that, he was laughing, that like silly little book, and we were noticing habits, process, and comprehension. And so I started to think about when I was getting ready to talk to you about nonfiction today, I thought, okay, well, let's just break it down into those categories. And when we think about habits, when we think about process, when we think about comprehension, there's predictable teaching, but there's also predictable problems. So I thought I would just start by kind of naming out some things for each of these categories. And this could even become a cheat sheet for you in your upcoming unit of things, or your current unit of things you might teach. It might be helpful even just down the road as we think about our nonfiction teaching in our classroom. And then I have some ideas for us in terms of other practical things that we can be doing in the classroom to support all of these things. I'm realizing that I had a runaway post-it somewhere, so I'm just getting another one. Okay, here we go. So when it comes to nonfiction, we're going to start with comprehension. Here's the secret. If you don't know all the books that kids are reading, this is true. We've talked about this in fiction before, that there's secret ways to be like, oh, so you're reading this book. I know that your character's complicated. Tell me about it. And Ben's like, oh, my character's not complicated. I'm like, oh, actually, in the books that you're reading, your character is complicated. Or I can say, Michelle, so tell me about symbols in your book. Michelle says there's no symbols. And I know that it's a U plus, the book is at a level U and above. And I can say, oh, actually, Michelle, in the book you're reading, there will be symbolism. So as you keep reading, pay attention to those symbols that come up. There's little tricks that we have as teachers to know what to teach inside of fiction based on the level that it is. Nonfiction is trickier because it's not always black and white. That said, there are 4 ways that nonfiction gets more or less complex. Okay, 4 major ways. And when somebody shared this to me, it was such a light bulb moment because it changed the way that I teach nonfiction, meaning I feel like I'm a lot more focused. So if I have a couple examples, I'm just going to share 2 quick ones with you. This one says, the amazing octopus. Of all the strange and wonderful creatures of the ocean, one stands out. It is the amazing octopus. There are over 300 different types of octopus that can be found in every ocean. Bodies like no other. The octopus has a body unlike any other. You get the idea. If I skip ahead and I look at another text, similar text, but another level, of all the strange and wonderful creatures that live in the ocean, one unique cephalad stands out above the rest. Mischief and craft are plainly seen to be the characteristics of this creature. Claudius, alien, like already I'm like, whoa, these feel very different, don't they? Like this one's obviously more complex than this one. But what are the comprehension strategies that make this more complex? And this is where the 4 come in. The first one is main idea. And it's really how obvious is the main idea. How obvious is the main idea? How complex is the main idea? When it comes to main idea, you start with topic. So if I'm reading this book on snakes and I'm a 2nd grader or 1st grader, there probably a lot of times there's not even a main idea. It's just kind of all about like here's their body, here's what they do. There's not a main idea of this book. It's about the topic. And kids move from, or books go from being about a topic to being a statement or a main idea about a topic. From the topic to the main idea about the topic, they start to move into multiple main ideas. And in a lot of the books that your kids are reading, they're probably at the point where they're moving into multiple main ideas. So it's topic moving into main idea. What's the book saying about the topic to multiple main ideas? There's a lot of other things in here. I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but just know that main idea is one of the major, obviously you guys know this, I don't need to share this. It's one of the main things that you're going to teach inside of nonfiction. And the reason why it doesn't go anywhere is because it just gets harder. So I can read The Amazing Octopus and I can say, octopi have bodies like no other. There's my main idea, right? Like the main idea is right there. It's in the text versus here, I'm going to have to do a lot more reading. I even look at the title here, The Amazing Octopus, and it's very different than the honorary vertebrae in terms of coming up with the main idea. So one major category of what we teach inside of nonfiction is main idea. The second one, this was my Post-it that ran away, so I've got to rewrite it here. The second one is the vocabulary. And when we think about vocabulary, not just the vocabulary in terms of the honorary vertebrae and the vocabulary that's the technical vocabulary, but also the words that are included. And the more complex texts get, kids have to start to see that like the word cephalad or cephalopod is specific to the octopus versus I might keep reading even the word mischief. That's not necessarily specific to the octopus. It's just tricky vocabulary. So as texts get harder, you need to keep teaching vocabulary because the vocabulary starts to become more complex. Also in easier books, the vocabulary definitions are embedded right in the words themselves. It'll say this means or this is versus here you have to infer that. Even easier than this, and there's a glossary. There's like a little definition box right here that tells you what that word means. Makes sense, right? So for comprehension, we've got main idea, we've got vocab, two other big categories. Knowledge demands. This is why it's so hard to level nonfiction because it's your background knowledge. So if you've got a kid who loves snakes, they're going to know more about this book. They're going to do better or be able to read this book better than I will be able to, right? If you know something about the octopus, you're going to be ready to read this versus if you know nothing, you might need to start with this. So I will even teach middle schoolers, especially, how to find different levels of nonfiction texts and to find like find a text set. So if I decide that I want to research the food chain or GMOs or whatever it is, try and find multiple texts on that topic so that I can find an easier one to build my background knowledge and a harder one once I have background knowledge. Because that's one of the biggest things to teach kids is that they have to learn how to build their background knowledge. And that's going to help them in any of the other things that they teach. So when it comes to comprehension, I teach main idea, I teach vocabulary, I teach how to build your background knowledge and how authors build your background knowledge. And then I teach into structure. And this one, when I say structure, I'm not doing a good job of like how these go, but structure, this could be literally the text features and the pictures that are in here and how the text is built and put on the page. Or it could be structure in terms of compare and contrast, problem solution. Or, and this is probably what most applies to you all, having been in your classrooms and seen some of your units, it could be structure in terms of narrative nonfiction, expository nonfiction, hybrid nonfiction. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this really quick. So when it comes to comprehension, we can teach main idea, we can teach vocabulary, we can teach knowledge demands, and then we have to teach structure. I'm going to focus on this little pink Post-it for a minute because I actually think that this is one thing that comes up, especially at the middle school level, is a lot of times the nonfiction that kids are reading is primarily narrative nonfiction. It's not a bad thing. We talked about this a little bit last year when I was there. But know that narrative nonfiction, like a biography, or we were reading about people today in the 6th grade class, is easier to follow for kids because it's like a story, right? There's a reason why we like documentaries, many like over, sitting and watching, well, it depends on who you are, the, Science Network or the History Channel, because it feels like it follows a story. And so narrative is easier to follow. So if given the choice, kids will probably go to narrative nonfiction. From there, there's expository nonfiction. And a lot of times in schools, we don't cover this as much in ELA because we think they're getting it in social studies and science and in other content area. But it's important to tackle for kids that they know that there's a difference between expository nonfiction and narrative nonfiction, and that they use their muscles. They know they have to grow their muscles for different books based on the type of book it is. So like kids would be more apt to go to this book because it's a story. It's a story about these basketball players. Versus if I go to this book, it's much more complicated because it's nonfiction all about different things in society, going green type of things. So you get the idea of where I'm going with this, right? So like this is more of a science textbook versus the narrative. So you'll want to teach kids the differences between those two things. And then last but not least, when it comes to comprehension, teaching kids that there's a hybrid, that a lot of times there's narrative inside of nonfiction. So I can be reading Going Blue, and when I'm reading Going Blue, I might get to certain parts where there's stories that come up and there's little narrative snippets. And as a reader, I need to go back and forth between my comprehension skills for narrative and my comprehension skills for information. That makes sense to you guys. That was a lot of Megan rambling, but hopefully that makes sense just in terms of thinking about how complex nonfiction can be. Yes. I'm going to jump in on that really quick. Jillian said that kids' main idea, and there's a reason Jillian said her kids struggle with main idea. Now, hopefully when I showed you that, there's a reason why they struggle and it's not going anywhere. It's because the more difficult the book, the more difficult the main idea. Like it's not, and I'm not saying, so just say to them, you're going to keep learning it, but that doesn't mean we have to teach it the same way. So I think teaching them, and we talked about some of this last year, different strategies for finding main idea can be really helpful. Like repeated words and phrases is always helpful. Thinking about looking at, I did some of this with some of you in 7th grade. I was picturing Diane, she's not on. Oh, you are still on here in your classroom doing some of this last year. Even just doing a preview of the text can help you with main idea. You have to read to find out if that ends up being the main idea, but I can study the text features and think, what is this mostly teaching me? And then let me read to confirm that, either confirm or revise that. Teaching kids to find main ideas as they read. So to chunk it, I know you've done this before, but get the main idea of each part, and those essentially become your bullets. So if I get the main idea of 4 different paragraphs, and then I put that together, it's like reverse, well, it's not reverse boxes and bullets, it's chunking. So main idea of each part, that's helpful. And then not last but not least, but another one, a final one with main idea is also the reverse boxes and bullets. Finish reading a text and say 3, 4, 5 things that you learned. What's an umbrella you could put over those 3, 4, or 5 things? And that will be your main idea. So trying to think about like, if I put together all these facts in one statement, not in one summary statement, that's not where you're going, but I have to make a statement that would be an umbrella for all of these. So I even wonder, to your point, Jillian, and then I'll pause, like making a chart of those 5 or 6 strategies that I just said, and you just added another one, right? So repeated words and phrases, orient yourself to the text and predict what it might be. The other two that I just said, reverse boxes and bullets, chunking it, topic, sentence, name it, verb, big picture. I love that. I even think you can have kids, you saw that little chart that I made here of topic, main idea, and then multiple main ideas. Have them pick up a book, like what would be a better title for this book? So instead of snakes, I'm going to call it this. I think what's tricky with narrative nonfiction is they start to think, what am I getting from the lesson learned from the story and what's the main idea? So if you can help them first do it kind of more black and white, let me find the lesson learned by the character, the true character in this book, then let me find the main idea of expository, then let me put the two together. That can also be really helpful, like eye-opening for them to see how all those things blend together. The last strategy that I would add to that, I just thought of another tried and true. So now maybe we're at like 6, and you don't have to teach those, don't have to all be at separate days. Structure. Look at how the book goes. And if you can figure out how the book goes and name the structure, that will lead to the main idea usually. So if it's chronological, so if it's a story about somebody, I might say Michelle Thompson's life has changed over time. So I have the word time in my main idea. Or if it's a problem solution structure, my main idea statement usually refers to problem solution. There are many problems faced in underwater creatures today. That's not a good main idea statement, but you get what I mean. Like name the problem, and then that I'm like, where did that come from? Name the problem, and then in my main idea statement can have that in that. Cause and effect, right? Like this is the, so if you name the structure and then name the main idea, that helps too. Yes, the multiple is really, really hard. I think the multiple is one of the hardest things for them. You can have a debate. Is it more A or B? That's been really fun. Speaking of engagement, we come full circle. Put up 2 main ideas before you do a read aloud. You could even do this. So I know it seems counterproductive because you're like, wait, but then I'm not teaching them to find main idea, but do the work for them. Put 2 or 3 main ideas up. You could even have 4. I'm picturing like a Jamboard right now with like the main ideas in the corners. Do some reading, and they have to debate it out or even tally or write about like which one of these 4 main ideas do we think is most applicable to this text. Also helps them with testing type questions. That's another, to go at it at the back angle instead of coming up with the main idea, deciding which it is. Awesome. Okay. And then I'll pause so we can chat. Let me just finish these last 2 things with process and habits for nonfiction. And then you guys can chime in and let me know what you're thinking. Process is the same, but I actually find, we talked last time about what process is, and Jillian, you popped in today when we were doing some of that with your kids. But keep in mind when we talk, and under process, fluency is only one part of that. I get it, but it's one that I'm focusing on with you because I think in middle school, especially, the physical act of reading, kids can mostly, for the most part, do. It's just the sound of their voice when they're reading those more complicated texts. And so that's where, just like we talked about last time, you have phrasing, and that's thinking of like the scoops instead of word by word. You have pacing, how fast or how slow I'm reading. And you have expression, paying attention to the punctuation and how my voice changes based on the author's road signals. With nonfiction, I find that this is far different than narrative. It's harder. In fact, I bet if you were to ask your readers in your classroom to read a snippet for you and submit it of them reading nonfiction, you're going to find that all of them probably need some coaching in one of these things. Not because I need them to be the next Ken Burns on a documentary, but because they probably read nonfiction very choppy right now. It's just what kids are used to. When they get to a more complex text, oftentimes fluency breaks down. And so you might do some practicing with them of reading some expository nonfiction, especially having them work on their fluency, whether it's a whole group lesson or an individual lesson. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention was around habits. And I taught a lesson with some of Jillian's kids on this today, was note-taking. And I think when it comes to nonfiction, like that is one of the number 1 habits that I teach into, is that it is nonfiction reading, not nonfiction writing notes. And a lot of times kids don't read. They spend the whole time literally just copying facts. Like it becomes a copying fact lesson, not a reading lesson. And so I taught a small group, and I'll share the video with you guys to some kids in Mrs. Collins' class today, where I taught them to read, flip, teach, write. That sounds fancier than it is. And they don't physically have to flip or teach. But the idea is I read something, I pause, I tell you what I learned. I can glance back if I need to, but I'm not reading off of that. Sometimes I even practice telling somebody what I learned, or if nobody's around me, I tell myself in my head, what did you just learn? And then I write down my notes. So it's not note taking while reading, it's reading and then jotting down some notes and then glancing back. I'm not saying I want them to put down misinformation, but I find that one of the biggest habits to break is that idea of copying instead of actually reading and understanding and processing. And so they end up having like a page full of notes. I've seen, you guys have all seen it, haven't you? Where kids have an entire page of literally like 500 notes from the books that they read, and they don't understand anything of what they learned from it because it's just a page of notes. So that would be one habit. And then the second habit for nonfiction is taking it all in, looking at everything on the page. So my second, if I were to say the other major habit for nonfiction is that they don't look at everything. They either just look at the pictures or they just look at the words, or they don't put the two together. So like even, and I did a bad job of modeling this today. I'm thinking specifically the book, Jillian, in your class that we were reading, and there was like there were the text features on that little page on about from Tilly. And with the first two groups, we didn't really even look at the text features. Now I was focusing on something different with them, but I think that's so indicative of what kids do a lot when they go to nonfiction. They go to the part that's interesting to them, whether that be the picture, the chart, the graph, or the words, and they skip the other things. So trying to teach kids how to take it all in. During lunch today, I was with another one of my nephews, whom my sister conveniently went and took her exercise break during his lunch when it happened to be my lunch. She's at home being quarantined, and then was like, "Why don't you read to your aunt?" And so I spent my lunch with Tommy, but he was reading this new book about dragons. It wasn't nonfiction, but he was pretty well into it. And I'm like, "Are there pictures in that book, Tommy?" I was really curious. He's like, "Oh yeah, in the beginning, there's like this map and this family tree and this." Look at that, like go back, look at, and he chimed in, he's like, the prologue, I think maybe I should read that too. I'm like, well, the prologue. But the point is, I think we all do that, right? We jump to the part that we want to read, we jump to what we want to look at. And I think it's probably true of fiction and nonfiction, but I think especially with nonfiction, it becomes look for the shiny thing, look for the fact, look for the cool thing, look for the story, or read the story and don't pay attention to the other things. So inside of your conferring or small groups or just working with kids or trying to teach some lessons, whatever we're doing, keep our head above water. When it comes to nonfiction, although there's a lot of standards and a lot of books to teach, this is the same for fiction and nonfiction. But if you can think note taking, taking it all in, main idea, vocab, background knowledge, and structure, that's really what you need to grow your skill set and tackle nonfiction texts. And to be quite honest, when it comes to state testing, it's going to fall under those categories anyways. The questions that they're being asked are questions around knowledge demands that the author assumes, vocabulary, main idea and details, etc. That makes sense. I hope that was helpful. It was kind of a long spattering of things. The one thing I will say, and I'm happy to share this, I will share, I'm going to put together a file of some of the things that have come up today. It's really fun to do with kids, the type of thing, I've got too many papers today, but doing what I was showing you here, you can even do this with them. Like put it on them, have them read different, I'll share these with you. This is the same article, but at different levels. Have them look at how nonfiction gets more difficult across topics. Or even like that little piece we read from Tilly today, or they were reading about, was it Tilly Smith? Tilly, I can't remember, Tilly or Tully, but they could like compare and contrast that to a book about earthquakes, to a book about tsunamis, to to a Who Was book. Like even to have them compare and contrast that book that they were reading today to a Who Was book that they haven't read since second grade is really, really helpful for kids to understand what skills that they need. Because nonfiction is very different than fiction. It's not just about the book looking thicker or the book looking bigger. It's these like other nuances that we need to know in order to be able to read it. That was just, I'm going to stop recording there. That was just a lot of information, but